The store was bustling with usual hum of everyday shoppers. People moved in and out, picking up groceries, household items, and snacks, their carts weaving through aisles as they mindlessly went about their routines. But in middle of all this normalcy, something felt off. The air seemed to change as the incident unfolded, and before long, it wasn't just any ordinary day at the store. It was about to become the scene of an encounter that no one would ever forget. A woman, well into her middle years, stood near aisle, her eyes scanning shelves. Her expression was tight, like she had just discovered something unexpected, something out of place. She had been watching him for a while now. She had been watching him since he entered the store, from the moment his foot crossed the threshold, and for some reason, something about his presence had set her off. It wasn't his clothes, his demeanor, or the way he walked. No, it was something more insidious. It was the color of his skin that triggered something inside her, a deep, almost primal discomfort. She couldn't pinpoint why, but her gaze never left him. She didn't know his name, didn't know a thing about him, but it didn't matter. In her mind, he didn't belong here. Not in this store. Not in her space. She picked up her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed the number without even thinking. I need someone here now. There's a man, a black man, acting suspicious. He's been walking around, looking like he's up to something. I don't feel safe. The words hung in the air, heavy with prejudice, yet she believed them without a second thought. The man was completely unaware of the tension brewing behind him. He was just trying to finish his shopping in peace, navigating the aisles with his shopping list in hand. He wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, no strange behavior, no signs of wrongdoing. But for a woman, that wasn't enough. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was doing something wrong. In her mind, he didn't belong here, and she had to make sure the situation was handled. As the woman made call, her eyes didn't leave him for a second. She watched his every move, scrutinizing each decision as though he was committing a crime just by being there. Meanwhile, the man continued with his task, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break out. But as the call ended, and words "police are on the way" slipped from her lips, the situation began to escalate. The man, still clueless, suddenly noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The friendly chatter around him had faded. People were looking at him strange, uncomfortable glances. Some even moved out of his way, as if he were some kind of threat. He looked around, his senses alert now. What was going on? Why were people acting like this? Just then, a security guard walked up to him, his face stern. Sir, I need to ask you to come with me. The man's heart raced. What had he done wrong? He hadn't done anything to warrant this. Is there a problem? He asked, trying to keep his voice calm. But guard didn't answer, merely gesturing for him to follow. Confused and frustrated, he complied, trying to figure out what was going on. But before he could fully grasp the situation, he heard the unmistakable sound of sirens outside the store. They were coming. The police were on their way. The woman, standing near the aisle with her phone still in hand, watched it all unfold with an eerie sense of satisfaction. She had done what she felt was necessary. She had made sure someone was going to deal with him. The man had dared to be in her space, and now he was going to face the consequences. But what happened next would be far beyond anything anyone could have predicted. As the police arrived and began to assess the situation, something strange began to happen. The people around them, witnesses to the scene unfolding, started to speak up. They began to ask questions. What did he do wrong? One person asked. Why are the police here for him? Another murmured. Slowly, the crowd began to question the woman's story. The man was still trying to figure out what was happening, but now, with the crowd turning against the woman, he began to feel a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to go the way she expected. But as the officers spoke to the woman, and her story started to unravel under scrutiny. She began to grow defensive, her narrative shifting in subtle ways. And as the tension in the store grew, the police officers faced an unexpected dilemma. What would they do? How would they handle a situation that was quickly spiraling out of control? The woman's claim was falling apart, but the man was now in a vulnerable position. Would the truth come out in time, or would the false narrative be enough to sway the situation in the woman's favor? The atmosphere was thick with uncertainty. The store was no longer just a place of shopping, it was a battleground where accusations, assumptions, and prejudices were being tested. What would happen next? Stay tuned as we uncover the truth behind the shocking turn of events. The tension in the store was palpable. Shoppers had paused their activities, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding before them. Some whispered to each other, while others watched in disbelief. No one knew exactly what was going on, but one thing was clear: something wasn't right. It had started with a single phone call, but now, it was becoming much more than just a misunderstanding. It was a clash between perception and reality, a test of how much people were willing to believe a story simply because it had been told by someone in authority. The man stood there, his back straight, his hands clenched by his sides, as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He hadn't seen the woman, he didn't know who she was, nor did he care. All he had been focused on was getting the things he needed, ticking off the items on his list as he moved from aisle to aisle. The bright fluorescent lights above him flickered slightly, casting an eerie glow over the scene, making everything feel a little more surreal. The security guard who had approached him was tall and imposing, his arms crossed over his chest. He hadn't said much, just a few curt words asking him to follow. The man had no reason to argue. After all, in a public place, it wasn't unusual for security to make sure things stayed under control. He had assumed that perhaps it was a routine check, nothing to worry about. But now, with the sirens approaching, and the realization setting in that the police were on their way, a gnawing sense of dread started to creep into him. He had been in situations before, confrontations, even, but this felt different. This wasn't about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was something deeper, something that he couldn't quite put his finger on. As he stood there, a sudden thought crossed his mind. What if they don't believe me? The question hit him hard, and he immediately tried to push it away. He was innocent. He hadn't done anything wrong. But there it was again, gnawing at him. What if this wasn't just a misunderstanding? What if someone had decided to make him the villain in their story? The woman, on the other hand, stood several aisles away, her eyes fixed on the officers who were now approaching her. She hadn't moved since making the call. Her hands were shaking, but it wasn't from fear, it was from the rush of adrenaline that surged through her as she waited for the police to arrive. She had told the truth. She had seen him acting suspiciously. She had done the right thing. It was all in her hands now. But even as she clung to her sense of righteousness, something inside her nagged at her, a small voice that whispered that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as clear-cut as she had imagined. She could feel the stares of the other shoppers, some of them watching her, others looking at the man who was now surrounded by security and officers. Were they questioning her? Did they think she was lying? It was a strange feeling, one she hadn't expected. As the officers spoke to her, she noticed a shift in their demeanor. They didn't seem to be as convinced by her story as she had expected. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice, asked her to explain exactly what had happened. The woman's words faltered slightly, but she pushed through, recounting the story in the same way she had told it on the phone. He was acting strange, she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. Walking up and down the aisles, looking around like he was hiding something. I didn't feel safe. He didn't belong here. The officer nodded, taking notes. What exactly about his behavior seemed suspicious? She asked, her tone measured. The woman's mind raced. She had seen the man walking through the aisles, but now, she couldn't remember any specific action that would have warranted calling the police. She had jumped to conclusions, made assumptions based on his appearance. But in that moment, something shifted. The officer's questioning made her start to wonder if her fears had clouded her judgment. Still, she couldn't back down. She had made the call, and now the police were here. They would deal with him. Meanwhile, the man stood in the center of the store, the eyes of everyone on him. He felt exposed, vulnerable. The police had arrived and were now speaking to the security guard, who was giving his own version of events. The officers seemed to be taking everything in with an air of professionalism, but there was an undeniable undercurrent of suspicion. He could feel it, even if they weren't saying it outright. They were looking at him like he was guilty of something, even though he hadn't done a single thing wrong. He watched as one officer, a tall man with a firm jawline, approached him. "Sir, we need to talk to you. Please come with us." The man nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no choice but to comply. But as they walked toward the back of store, away from prying eyes of the shoppers, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a routine matter. The police weren't here because of a misunderstanding. There was more at play here, something deeper that he couldn't quite understand. Back at the front of the store, the woman stood quietly, trying to process everything that was happening. She could hear the murmurs of the other shoppers around her, but she didn't pay them much attention. Her focus was entirely on the situation with the man. As the officers escorted him away, her sense of relief grew. The situation was under control now. Everything was going according to plan. But just as she thought she could breathe a sigh of relief, something unexpected happened. One of the shoppers, a middle-aged man with a beard and glasses, approached her. He was shaking his head, his expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. "I don't know what you think you saw," he said, his voice low but firm, "but I don't think you understand what's going on here." The woman was taken aback. "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to hide defensiveness in her voice. "I saw him," the man continued, his eyes locking with hers. "He wasn't doing anything suspicious. In fact, I was watching him the whole time. He was just shopping." "You've got it wrong." The words stung, but the woman didn't let it show. She turned away, pretending she hadn't heard him. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Was it possible she had misjudged the situation? Could she have been wrong? She pushed thought away. No, she couldn't be wrong. The man had made her feel unsafe, and she had done what anyone would do in that situation. But as the minutes passed and the police continued to question the man, the tension in store grew. It wasn't just the woman's story that was under scrutiny now, it was everyone's perception of what had really happened. Would the truth come out? Would anyone believe the man, or would the woman's accusations be enough to seal his fate? The officers were now gathered around man in the back of the store, their voices hushed, their words impossible to hear from where the woman stood. The uncertainty hung in the air like a thick fog, and she felt the weight of it pressing down on her. She had no way of knowing how this would end, but one thing was certain, the story was far from over. And as the minutes ticked by, woman couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was spiraling out of her control. She had made a call. She had taken action. But now, the truth was starting to unravel, and she was left to wonder if she had made the right decision. Was she really doing the right thing? Was she really protecting herself, or had she just made a terrible mistake? The tension in the store built, the air thick with unanswered questions. And the only thing that was clear was that the story was far from over. What would happen next? Would the man be exonerated, or would the woman's accusations be enough to turn everything in her favor? Only time would tell. But for now, everything hung in the balance. The store was eerily quiet now, the noise of the bustling aisles replaced with a heavy silence. Shoppers continued to mill about, but their movements seemed more mechanical, as though they were unsure whether to stay or leave, to watch or ignore. The confusion was palpable. In one corner of the store, a woman stood with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes darting between the officer's man being questioned, and few people who were still glancing her way. She could feel weight of their eyes on her, some of them filled with doubt, others tinged with judgment. She didn't know what they thought, but she could sense the shifting energy in room. It was no longer just a confrontation between her and the man, it was something much bigger, something that made everyone uneasy. The man, now seated in back office with 2 officers flanking him, was beginning to unravel. His thoughts were a blur, bouncing between frustration, confusion, and a strange sense of isolation. He had done nothing wrong. He had been minding his own business, doing what anyone else would do. But here he was, being questioned like he was a criminal, a suspect in a crime he hadn't committed. He had never imagined his day would take such a turn. The officers were polite but firm, asking him the same questions over and over, trying to make sense of the situation. But nothing added up. Nothing made sense. They had no evidence, no reason to believe he was doing anything out of the ordinary. But that didn't seem to matter. "Just sit tight," one of the officers had told him when he first walked into the back room. "We're trying to get to the bottom of this." The officer's voice was calm, but it didn't reassure him. He didn't need to be sitting in some back office, being questioned like a suspect. He had done nothing wrong. All he had wanted was to buy his groceries and go home. But now, as the minutes dragged on and the silence stretched between them, he felt more and more trapped, as though he were slowly losing control of the situation. Outside, the store was slowly filling with tension, a sense of unease hanging thick in the air. Some of the shoppers had left, uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them. Others remained, whispering amongst themselves, debating what had really happened. The whispers were loud enough to carry, and the woman couldn't help but overhear some of the conversations. "I saw him too," one woman said. "He didn't seem like he was doing anything wrong." The voice was quiet, but the message was clear. "I don't know," another person responded. She looked pretty shaken when she made the call. Maybe there was something more to it. The woman's hands trembled as she gripped her shopping cart, trying to ignore the words. She knew what she had seen. She had felt the fear, the discomfort when she watched him walk down the aisles. But the doubts started to creep in. Was she wrong? Had she misjudged him? The thought gnawed at her, but she quickly pushed it away. She couldn't second-guess herself now. She had made the call, and now the officers were involved. It was too late to turn back. Back in the back office, the man had his eyes closed, his thoughts a storm of frustration. He didn't know how long they'd been questioning him, it felt like hours. He was tired. He just wanted to leave. "What's going to happen?" he asked, his voice breaking through the silence. The officer sitting across from him looked up, meeting his gaze. "We're just doing our job, sir. We'll figure out what happened. Just stay calm." He nodded, but the words didn't bring him any comfort. Calm? How could he be calm? He had never felt more on edge in his life. This wasn't just about a shopping trip gone wrong, it was about something much deeper. It was about assumptions. It was about the way people saw him, the way his presence made others uncomfortable, even if he had done nothing to warrant it. Was this how it was always going to be for him? He had spent so much of his life trying to fit in, to be normal, to be just another person in the crowd. But moments like this made him question everything. Was he always going to be seen as different, as suspicious, just because of the color of his skin? The door to the back office opened, and another officer stepped in, his face grim. The first officer stood up, and the two exchanged a few quiet words. The man couldn't hear their conversation, but he could tell from their expressions that something wasn't right. The officer who had been sitting across from him turned back to him, his tone much more serious now. "We need you to stay here for a little while longer," the officer said. "There's something we need to clarify." The man felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean? What's going on?" "I can't give you any details right now. Just stay calm." The officer's words were no longer reassuring, they felt more like a warning. Meanwhile, outside the office, the woman's nerves were fraying. She couldn't stand still any longer, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this. She had thought the police would show up, talk to the man, and the situation would be settled. But now, as the minutes dragged on, she found herself questioning everything. She had acted out of fear, and maybe just maybe that fear had been misplaced. A part of her wanted to approach the officers, to explain herself, to tell them what had happened. But another part of her was terrified that they would turn on her, that they would see her as the one who had caused all of this. She couldn't bear the thought of that. Then, without warning, the doors to the back office opened again. This time, a different officer stepped out, his face expressionless. He walked straight past the woman, ignoring her completely, and toward the front of the store, his eyes scanning the room. The woman's heart skipped a beat. Was this it? Was the man being let go? She couldn't bear the thought of him walking out of the store, free to go about his life as though nothing had happened. No, she needed to make sure the police understood what she had seen. She needed to make sure they knew she had done the right thing. But as she moved to follow the officer, her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden appearance of another shopper, a man who had been watching the entire scene unfold. He looked at her with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Is he going to be okay?" he asked, his voice low. The woman looked up at him, her mind racing. She didn't know how to answer. Would the man be okay? Would anyone be okay? She had no idea. "I don't know," she said, her voice faltering. I just did what I thought was right." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything more, but the look in his eyes stayed with her as he walked away. As the officers gathered around the front of the store, a new sense of urgency seemed to take hold. The air was thick with anticipation, but no one was speaking. The officers exchanged glances, and the shoppers whispered among themselves, still unsure of what to make of the situation. And as the woman stood there, her heart racing, she knew that this wasn't going to end the way she thought it would. No one was going to leave this store with simple answers. The truth was slipping through her fingers, and she wasn't sure she would be able to hold on to it much longer. The tension in the store was palpable, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The hum of fluorescent lights above seemed deafening in the stillness, and even the soft shuffle of feet across the linoleum floor felt like a loud, unwanted interruption. The woman stood at the edge of the aisle, her heart racing in her chest as she watched the officers gather in front of the store. She was unsure of what was happening, but she could feel the sense of urgency thickening the air. There was a growing sense that something was about to break, that everything was on the brink of a tipping point. The man, still in the back office, sat alone now, his mind spinning. The questions had stopped, the officers' voices had gone silent, and for the first time, he was left with nothing but his own thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was bigger than him, bigger than this store. It was about something more, the weight of the assumptions placed on him because of the way he looked, the way he moved through the world. How many times had he been the one to feel this pressure, to feel the eyes of others scrutinizing him, watching him from the corner of their vision? Today, though, the spotlight felt like it was finally on him in full force. And all he wanted was to walk out of that office, out of that store, and back to the safety of his own life. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that easy. There was too much at stake now. He couldn't just walk out of here without confronting what had led him to this moment. How had things escalated to this point? What had he done wrong? He had been minding his business, going about his day just like anyone else. But the doubt had started to creep in. What if she had been right? What if there was something he didn't see, something that made her react the way she did? He wasn't sure anymore. His thoughts were a blur of anger, confusion, and frustration. All he knew was that he was stuck, waiting for someone to tell him what would happen next. Outside, the store had taken on an air of heightened anxiety. People were beginning to notice the officers moving around, exchanging quick words, scanning the crowd. The whispers were louder now, more pointed. Some people looked around nervously, unsure if they should leave or stay. Others stood still, rooted to their spots, as though they were waiting for the inevitable explosion that would follow. The woman could feel the weight of their eyes on her, their silent judgments pressing down on her shoulders. Her hands trembled, her palms slick with sweat as she gripped the edge of her cart. She wanted to walk away, to slip out of the store quietly and pretend like nothing had happened. But there was no escaping the situation now. She had been a part of it. The officers had been called, the scene had played out, and she had made the decision to act. But the more she replayed the events in her mind, the less certain she became. Was she overreacting? Was it possible that she had misunderstood the whole situation? The nagging doubt continued to eat at her, but she refused to let it show. She had done what she thought was right. But deep down, she knew that right now, in this very moment, the truth seemed much murkier than it had when she first made the call. As she tried to steady her nerves, she noticed something. An officer had been talking to another shopper, a man who had been near her when everything started. He was speaking in hushed tones, his body language tense, as he pointed toward the back of the store. The woman's stomach churned. She didn't know if the officer was speaking to him about the man who was still in the back office, but the thought made her uneasy. The officer's voice was low, but the words carried enough for her to catch a snippet. "Is it worth the risk?" She heard him ask, his voice sharp, but filled with something else, something that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't just about what had happened in the store. It was something deeper. The question lingered in her mind as the minutes stretched on. What risk? What did the officer mean? She had no answers, just a growing sense of dread. Inside the back office, the silence had become unbearable. The man had stopped asking questions. He had stopped wondering what was going to happen. All that remained was a simmering frustration, a burning anger that seemed to rise within him with each passing second. He was waiting for the officers to make their decision, but in his mind, he was already imagining the worst. Would they arrest him? Would they accuse him of something he hadn't done? Was he even safe anymore? And then, a voice broke through the silence. One of the officers returned to the room, his face unreadable. The man's heart skipped a beat, his pulse quickening. He couldn't read the officer's expression, but the tension in the air was thick, like something was about to snap. "Can you tell me again what happened when you first entered the store?" the officer asked, his voice calm but firm. The man blinked, the question catching him off guard. "I walked in." "That's it?" "I just walked in. I don't know what else you want me to say." The officer didn't reply immediately. He just stood there, watching the man carefully, as though searching for something. The silence stretched long between them, and the man's stomach tightened. "I need you to stay calm," the officer said after a long pause. "We're just trying to get all the details right. Something doesn't add up here, and we need to understand what happened." The man felt a chill run down his spine. Something didn't add up. What was that supposed to mean? His mind raced with possibilities. What was the officer implying? Was he suggesting that the woman had been right? That there had been something suspicious about his behavior after all? He couldn't think clearly anymore. His thoughts were clouded by the uncertainty that hung over him. Outside, the murmurs had died down, but the tension was still there, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. People had started to leave, but the eyes of those still lingering on the scene remained sharp. The officers were still gathered near the front, and the woman felt a growing sense of urgency, like a clock was ticking down to some inevitable moment. She couldn't stand it anymore. The questions, the doubts, the way everyone seemed to be watching her. She had to know what was happening. She had to find out what the officers were planning to do. And so, with her heart pounding in her chest, she made her way toward the front of the store, her every step filled with unease. As she reached the officers, the silence seemed to swell around her, suffocating. She was too late to turn back now. Whatever happened next would change everything. The truth would finally come to light. But the question remained, was she ready for what that truth would be? The woman reached the front of the store, her breath shallow, her palms slick with sweat. The officers were still standing near the entrance, their presence commanding the space, and she could feel the eyes of the remaining customers on her. Every step she took felt heavier, as though the weight of the situation was pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. Should she speak up? Should she explain herself again? But before she could make a decision, something unexpected happened. One of the officers, one who had been part of the group questioning the man in the back, turned his attention to her. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, she felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't the look of suspicion, it was something far more unsettling, as if he knew something she didn't. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his gaze that made her stomach drop. She opened her mouth to speak, but he held up a hand, stopping her before she could utter a word. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and serious, the tension in his tone unmistakable. Her heart skipped a beat. What did he mean by that? Why was he suddenly focused on her, when she was only here to check on the situation? The air around her grew colder as the officer's presence seemed to loom over her. She tried to steady herself, trying to maintain control of the conversation, but the unease kept building, swirling inside her like a storm. "About what?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think you've been misinformed," he replied, his voice a mix of authority and something else, something that hinted at a deeper layer of the story. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a split second, she thought she might have misheard him. What was he trying to say? Before she could react, another officer appeared, walking briskly from the back of the store, his expression just as tense. This officer had a different air about him, one that spoke of experience, someone who had seen far more than he should have. He didn't look at her directly, instead nodding to the officer who had just spoken. "There's something you need to know," the second officer said, his voice laced with urgency. "The woman who called us, she wasn't telling the full story. We've got evidence, and we're starting to think this whole situation wasn't what it seemed." A knot twisted in her stomach. The words, although carefully measured, cut through the tension in the air like a sharp blade. Evidence? What kind of evidence? She was no longer sure if she was the one in the wrong, or if something far more complicated was unfolding right in front of her. "We need to speak with you, too," the officer continued, his gaze shifting toward her. The mention of evidence had her entire body on alert. Something had changed. Everything she thought she understood was now called into question. The question lingered: had she been wrong to assume everything was as it seemed? Had she misunderstood something? The officers were giving her no answers, only raising more questions. As the woman stood frozen, the tension continued to mount. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, her head spinning with confusion. Was she being dragged into something bigger than she realized? Was this more than just a simple misunderstanding? She needed answers, but the officers weren't offering any, only shifting the narrative and creating a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. Then, the twist hit her like a wave, crashing over her thoughts. Another officer, one she hadn't even seen before, emerged from the back office. She recognized him immediately as the officer who had been talking to the man earlier. He looked completely different now. His expression was calm, almost disinterested, but there was something in his eyes that sent a chill through her. Something was off, something wasn't adding up, and she could feel it in every inch of her body. The man, still in the back office, had been quietly listening to everything from behind the door. He had heard snippets of conversation, the raised voices, the tension that had been escalating in the store. It wasn't just about a routine check anymore. He was part of a bigger story now, whether he liked it or not. The pieces of the puzzle he hadn't understood were beginning to fall into place, and the more he pieced them together, the more the situation felt like a trap. But a trap for whom? The officer who had just arrived now stepped forward, and with a steady, unwavering voice, he dropped a bombshell. "You might want to hear this, but you're not going to like it." The words hung in the air, a heavy promise of something that would change everything. The woman's stomach churned, her instincts screaming that the truth was about to come to light, but not the truth she had expected. "The woman who called us, she has a history," the officer continued, his voice laced with disbelief. "We've been tracking her for some time. Her behavior in the store isn't just about you. She's involved in something far bigger. Something that goes beyond race, beyond any simple misunderstanding." The woman's mind spun. She had no idea what the officer was talking about. All she knew was what she had seen, what she had experienced. How could the woman who had called the police be part of something bigger? What did that even mean? The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift with every word the officer said. She was no longer sure who the real culprit was, her or the woman who had called the authorities. "You've been caught in the middle of something far more complex," the officer said, almost with a note of sympathy in his voice. "And the man in the back? He's not what you think he is either." The woman's pulse quickened, and for the first time in a long while, she felt truly afraid. She had thought she understood what was happening, thought she had the situation under control. But now, every assumption she had made was crumbling, leaving nothing but uncertainty in its wake. The story had just turned on its head, and she was standing at the center of something far darker than she could have imagined. Her mind raced, but she didn't have time to process the officer's words. There was no room for confusion or hesitation now. The stakes had just been raised to an unimaginable level. The truth, whatever it was out there, but it was so far beyond what she had ever expected that she wasn't sure she could face it. What had she really walked into? What had started as a simple trip to the store had spiraled into something dangerous, something that might cost her more than she was willing to give. The tension in the air was suffocating as the officers exchanged looks, and the woman's mind raced to piece together the puzzle that was rapidly falling apart. The officer who had been so cryptic before now stepped closer, his voice steady but full of weight. "I know this might be a lot to take in, but there's something you need to understand. This isn't just about you. The woman who called the police, she's been involved in manipulating situations like this for a long time. You weren't just a victim of her bias, you were a pawn in a bigger scheme. We've got evidence, and we're starting to think this whole situation wasn't what it seemed." A knot twisted in her stomach. The words, although carefully measured, cut through the tension in the air like a sharp blade. Evidence? What kind of evidence? She was no longer sure if she was the one in the wrong, or if something far more complicated was unfolding right in front of her. "We need to speak with you, too," the officer continued, his gaze shifting toward her. The mention of evidence had her entire body on alert. Something had changed. Everything she thought she understood was now called into question. The question lingered: had she been wrong to assume everything was as it seemed? Had she misunderstood something? The officers were giving her no answers, only raising more questions. As the woman stood frozen, the tension continued to mount. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, her head spinning with confusion. Was she being dragged into something bigger than she realized? Was this more than just a simple misunderstanding? She needed answers, but the officers weren't offering any, only shifting the narrative and creating a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. Then, the twist hit her like a wave, crashing over her thoughts. Another officer, one she hadn't even seen before, emerged from the back office. She recognized him immediately as the officer who had been talking to the man earlier. He looked completely different now. His expression was calm, almost disinterested, but there was something in his eyes that sent a chill through her. Something was off, something wasn't adding up, and she could feel it in every inch of her body. The man, still in the back office, had been quietly listening to everything from behind the door. He had heard snippets of conversation, the raised voices, the tension that had been escalating in the store. It wasn't just about a routine check anymore. He was part of a bigger story now, whether he liked it or not. The pieces of the puzzle he hadn't understood were beginning to fall into place, and the more he pieced them together, the more the situation felt like a trap. But a trap for whom? The officer who had just arrived now stepped forward, and with a steady, unwavering voice, he dropped a bombshell. "You might want to hear this, but you're not going to like it." The words hung in the air, a heavy promise of something that would change everything. The woman's stomach churned, her instincts screaming that the truth was about to come to light, but not the truth she had expected. "The woman who called us, she has a history," the officer continued, his voice laced with disbelief. "We've been tracking her for some time. Her behavior in the store isn't just about you. She's involved in something far bigger. Something that goes beyond race, beyond any simple misunderstanding." The woman's mind spun. She had no idea what the officer was talking about. All she knew was what she had seen, what she had experienced. How could the woman who had called the police be part of something bigger? What did that even mean? The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift with every word the officer said. She was no longer sure who the real culprit was, her or the woman who had called the authorities. "You've been caught in the middle of something far more complex," the officer said, almost with a note of sympathy in his voice. "And the man in the back? He's not what you think he is either." The woman's pulse quickened, and for the first time in a long while, she felt truly afraid. She had thought she understood what was happening, thought she had the situation under control. But now, every assumption she had made was crumbling, leaving nothing but uncertainty in its wake. The story had just turned on its head, and she was standing at the center of something far darker than she could have imagined. Her mind raced, but she didn't have time to process the officer's words. There was no room for confusion or hesitation now. The stakes had just been raised to an unimaginable level. The truth, whatever it was out there, but it was so far beyond what she had ever expected that she wasn't sure she could face it. What had she really walked into? What had started as a simple trip to the store had spiraled into something dangerous, something that might cost her more than she was willing to give. The tension in the air was suffocating as the officers exchanged looks, and the woman's mind raced to piece together the puzzle that was rapidly falling apart. The officer who had been so cryptic before now stepped closer, his voice steady but full of weight. "I know this might be a lot to take in, but there's something you need to understand. This isn't just about you. The woman who called the police, she's been involved in manipulating situations like this for a long time. You weren't just a victim of her bias, you were a pawn in a bigger scheme." "There's more," he said. "We've been watching her for months. And there's something else you need to understand. The woman who called the police on you, she's gone. We've lost track of her. And that means this might not be over. The worst part of all of this is that you might never know the full truth." The words hit her like a punch. The woman who had set this all in motion was gone, and the consequences of her actions still hung in the balance. No resolution, no answers, just a deep, lingering uncertainty. She was left with more questions than when she had first walked into the store, and the knowledge that the chaos was far from over. As the officer finished speaking, she realized that the world wasn't always as clear-cut as she'd hoped. Sometimes the truth was far more elusive, hiding behind layers of manipulation and deceit. And in this case, it was clear, what had started as an innocent shopping trip had become a puzzle she might never fully solve. The officers turned and left, leaving her standing there with the man who had been caught in the middle of it all. The store, once full of people, was now eerily quiet. The tension had lifted, but the aftermath remained, heavy and unresolved. The woman looked at the man one last time, and in that shared silence, something shifted between them. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And in that final, lingering moment, the woman understood one thing: the true cost of division and manipulation wasn't just in the moments of chaos, it was in the long, slow unraveling of trust. As the door to the back office clicked shut behind her, the silence was almost unbearable. She stood there, reflecting on everything that had happened, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on her shoulders. The chaos, the fear, the uncertainty, it was all still so fresh in her mind. Yet, despite everything that had happened in the past few hours, there was one thing that stood out: this wasn't just about her anymore. It had never been. The reality of the situation had begun to settle in. She wasn't merely the victim in some random act of racism. She was part of something far larger, a disturbing pattern of manipulation and division that had been playing out right under everyone's noses. The woman who had called the police wasn't just another angry, ignorant person with a biased view of the world. She was a cog in a much larger machine, a machine designed to create fear, mistrust, and division among people. And she was gone. The officer had said that they had lost track of her, that she had vanished into the shadows. But as unsettling as that was, the woman couldn't help but wonder, was she gone for good, or was this just the beginning of something even darker? Was there a bigger network, a web of influence and manipulation that no one could fully see yet? These questions gnawed at her, but they would have to wait for answers. She needed time to process, to let it all sink in. For the moment, though, there was only the quiet of the store. The man who had been caught in the middle of all this was still there, standing across from her. They exchanged a few words, neither of them knowing quite what to say after everything they had just learned. But there was an understanding now, an unspoken bond formed out of the chaos they had endured together. Neither of them had asked for this, but here they were, sharing an experience that was far beyond their control. The woman turned to him, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Do you think she's really gone?" He met her gaze, his face serious, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I don't know. But something tells me this isn't over yet." The uncertainty hung in the air like a storm cloud, but neither of them had the answers they needed. Instead, they both stood there for a long moment, processing the information they had just learned, and wondering what would happen next. As the police began to leave the store, the woman looked out the large windows at the streets beyond. The world outside was bustling as usual, unaware of the deep currents of tension and manipulation that had been stirring beneath the surface. It was easy to forget that things like this were happening, that there were people out there whose sole purpose was to create division, to keep people apart. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain: she couldn't walk away from this. She had been dragged into something far bigger than a simple encounter in a store, and now that she knew the truth, she couldn't ignore it. She would have to be part of the solution, part of the larger conversation about how division, hate, and manipulation could no longer be tolerated. But that would take time, and she had a long road ahead. The police had gone, but the man remained, his expression thoughtful. She knew there were things left unsaid, questions still hanging between them. "So what now?" she asked. He let out a deep sigh, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I don't know. I didn't think it would go like this, but maybe that's how it is sometimes. Maybe the truth isn't as simple as we want it to be." Maybe we're all part of something we don't fully understand until it's too late. She nodded, feeling the weight of his words. There was truth in them. People were often too caught up in their own lives, their own struggles, to see the bigger picture, to understand that their actions could have ripple effects far beyond what they realized. And those who sought to manipulate others understood that better than anyone. They knew how to create fear, how to make people distrust each other, all while staying hidden in the background. She couldn't help but feel anger rising within her once again. Anger at the system, anger at the people who saw nothing but their own interests, and anger at herself for not seeing it sooner. But that anger, she realized, could either be her downfall or her driving force. If she channeled it the right way, it could fuel her to make the changes that were needed to help create a world where people weren't divided by their differences, but united in their shared humanity. But that, she knew, was a long road to walk. For now, all she could do was take one step at a time. She couldn't undo the past, but she could learn from it. And with that thought, she felt a small sense of peace settle within her. The man spoke again, breaking her thoughts. I don't know what happens next, but I do know this: it's not going to be easy. People like her don't just disappear. And we need to be ready for whatever comes next. She glanced at him, her eyes filled with a mix of determination and uncertainty. I'm ready. I don't know how this is going to play out, but I'm not backing down. Whatever happens, we have to make sure it doesn't happen again. The man gave her a small, almost reluctant smile. You're right. But I think we both know this is bigger than we thought. It's not just about one person or one incident. It's about everything: the way people see each other, the way they're manipulated, the way hate spreads. We have to be part of the solution. But it's not going to be easy. She nodded, a new sense of purpose forming within her. I know. But we can start by making sure the truth is heard. The world can't change if people don't see what's really happening. And with that, they both knew that their journey was far from over. It was only just beginning. As she left the store, the weight of everything that had transpired stayed with her. She couldn't forget it, nor would she try. The truth had been revealed, and though it was messy, painful, and uncertain, it was the only way forward. There was no turning back now. And while the streets outside were as busy as ever, the woman knew that she wasn't the same as she had been before. She had seen the darkness lurking behind the curtains, and though it was unsettling, it had also given her clarity. She wasn't going to let that darkness win. The world outside might have been unaware of the deep currents of division and manipulation that existed beneath the surface, but she wouldn't be one of those who stayed silent. She would be part of the change, no matter how difficult or uncertain that path might be. The woman knew the road ahead would be long, but she was no longer afraid. She had seen the truth, and she was ready to stand up for it. As she walked away, she made a promise to herself: this story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to anyone who had ever been manipulated, who had ever felt the sting of prejudice, who had ever been part of a system they didn't understand. It was a story of survival, of truth, and of the courage it took to face the unknown. And with that, she took the first step on her journey, not just toward healing, but toward making sure that the chaos she had experienced would not be in vain. It would be a catalyst for something bigger, something better. Because in the end, the greatest power anyone could have was the ability to change, to fight back, and to believe that, no matter how difficult the fight was, it was always worth it.